Hello, Imperium. Some of you might recognize me. I am Owen, also known as Tillery. I'm the producer here. So, I'm here to answer our questions from our January and February forum town halls. I'm going to be starting with the January questions and then moving on to the February questions. I'm going to be reading them off my monitor over here to my right, so it may be that I look over that direction rather than my camera periodically. That's because I'm terrible at actually recording videos and editing in general, which is why the graphic key behind me is pretty terrible. I want to go ahead and get started by saying thank you to everyone for submitting your questions. Thank you to everyone who has been engaging with me both on the forums, in-game via messages, and on the Discord as well. Now I'm going to go ahead and dive right in. So I'm going to go from top to bottom, more or less. I'm going to answer most of the questions, not necessarily all of them, as we go along, and hopefully this also spurs additional questions. So starting off, we have mentioned opening up the old temples. We don't expect a timeline on that, but does that include the inner rooms and more secret areas of them as well, so they're all accessible to all players? Are there going to be any limitations? Are they even going to be in the same plane or tucked away somewhere where people can have a good poke at them while not affecting combat by giving more nooks, crannies, and hidey holes with non-standard exits? That's kind of a tough question to answer. It's definitely something that we want to do. It's definitely on the roadmap. Exactly when and what that looks like, I'm not quite certain. My goal is to open up all the areas of those, whether that's to include the original special exits or secret exits or to have those connected in some way, I'm not certain. It's probably going to be done on a case-by-case basis. But for the most part, I do want them all to be accessible. As for whether or not there could be combat in them, probably, because I don't like creating no combat areas. In general, I think that combat should be possible throughout the entire game if there's a valid reason for it. So exactly what form that's going to take is going to depend in the long run on how it kind of shakes out when we do the first few. We're going to start with probably some of the easier to access ones with less complexity to them, and then move on. That's not at any specific point on the roadmap, because one of the specific things that I want to do is focus on story going into the rest of 2020. So the release of those may tie into story, it may tie into some kind of lore, but it's definitely not going to be the primary focus. As we get more volunteers playing as entities that may be able to put in some of that legwork, that might increase, but we'll kind of have to see that as it goes. Next question. The typo queue seems to be getting pretty unwieldy. Are the new volunteer staff going to help go through those and knock them out? Yes, in general. That is one of the first things that most new volunteers do, especially if those volunteers are eventually going to be able to do code. That said, we have to actually bring those people on board to be able to do it. Some of the typos that are in there, generally as the new ones come in, we try to fix those pretty quickly, but the older they are, the less often we look at them, and that's a problem. So we need to make sure that those things are categorized into the correct queues so that people know who can actually fix those things. If you don't have code access, there are some things you can fix, some things you can't, for example. And then once those things are categorized, we need to make sure that we go through them and start to clean them up. That's definitely a big thing that a lot of players see. It's one of the ways that they interact with the game the most. So mechanics aside, that's probably the most important thing we need to shore up. So that's definitely on the list. On a similar vein, is there any plan to poke around the help files to make them more intuitive? As a returning player, it's fairly difficult to access the appropriate help files at times. Absolutely want to do that. It's difficult for me to see exactly where those problems are. So if people don't submit bug reports or submit ideas for how to fix those, it's difficult for me to identify where those problems exist. So if you have suggestions, I absolutely want to hear them. You can submit those via the typo queue versus via the bug queue. You can also submit help edits if you have ideas there. If it's an overall organization problem, that probably needs to be tackled as a part of a larger project, which is absolutely on the table. So if you have particular issues that you think need to be addressed, submit those. If you think that it's more of a systemic problem and you can help kind of approach that, I definitely want to hear that as well. So the short answer is yes, that's something I want to fix, but the exact approach to that is going to be difficult for me. Mostly because I have been at this for a very long time. I've been playing the game for well over a decade. I've been volunteering and working on it for longer than that. So for slightly shorter than that. So it's going to be something that needs to be tackled by someone who actually has the visibility into what's hard. Once you know how to do something, it's hard to know what steps you skip or what you don't know. Next up, from a lore perspective, there is a considerable amount of lost knowledge, such as the meanings of each of the suns in the history on a lot of old areas, not to mention smatterings of lore for old bashing areas pushed in the mid-2000s. It'd be pretty interesting to have help files for those areas, reference event posts that are relevant so a curious player can more swiftly access the information about those places. Yeah, I'm definitely interested in having lore support for older things. there is a lot of hidden lore in the game, and I like that. I like having to kind of poke around and learn about it, but there's also a lot that should just be common knowledge to players and their characters. And so some of those things need to make it into either help files or be more searchable or more accessible. If you have a particular event reference, that's definitely, again, I'm leaning a lot on the player base to kind of make suggestions here. If you have a particular bashing area that just doesn't have enough information, but you know the lore exists, submit a help edit for it. Put the particular events post in, or if you want to see more of a particular source of lore, reach out to me via email or message, ask me about that. And if there's something in game, maybe I can direct you to it. If there's an events post, maybe I could direct you to that. It's a little bit easier for me to find content in those posts than it is for players, because obviously right now it's not player searchable. That is something that we want to fix up, but it's not in the near term. So if you kind of have ideas there, please, submit that to us. A few questions. Okay. Class leads. One disheartening thing many of us face: time and money into a favorite class, and the class lead completely changes it to something different or renders it less than useful. It's further disheartening when the only hope of adjustment lies a year away. Is there any hope of earlier adjustments? One of the things that I would like to do is have more common, smaller class lead rounds. That's something that we're kind of seeing with the short round that we're doing right now. I don't know if we're going to continue to do these short rounds with a small number of submissions, work through them, or if we're going to continue to do something like quarterly rounds. That's going to be very dependent on the resources that we have. We're kind of working through it as quickly as we can. I don't like making especially significant adjustments between those class leads because it makes it difficult for player feedback to be really heard. We tend to get very vocal voices between class lead rounds, but more voices during class lead rounds. And that's something that I definitely want to see. So as a result, I'm fine with making tweaks and adjustments here and there, but I don't want to do anything very large or kind of pull back too much on decisions made during class leads until another class lead round. I know that's not exactly the answer you want. I definitely want to be able to be more mobile there, more agile, but with the resourcing that we have, we kind of have to do it in these batches that we're doing. So yes and no, I guess more on the no side. More of a pick your brain question. You posted a chart of circle populations going back a long time. So the chart that I posted was actually only going back about a month or two. It wasn't a significant amount of time. Demonic has historically been underpopulated compared to the others. Again, during the period of time I posted, yes. There was a time in recent memory when Demonic was on top of the heap as well. The question at the core of this is, from the admin perspective, is there any idea as to why, and any ideas on what could be done to bolster this? So, yeah, there's a couple of different approaches that we can have here. One of them is to make sure that the lore that is existing is compelling to players that are lore-based, make sure that the mechanics are compelling to players that are mechanic-based. A lot of this is just kind of the ebb and flow that we naturally get. Some of that comes from particular classes being seen as powerful and people shifting into those. Some of it is just natural population shift. There's definitely more I'd like to do to make all of the circles, all of the factions more appealing in general, bring them back into some of their core lore, push some new storylines forward. And a lot of that's going to happen kind of as we go along. But as for kind of a lopsided population, that's kind of a difficult thing to deal with because a lot of that is just the way that players choose to go. So, like I said, I want to bolster some of the existing lore and bolster some of the mechanics up and kind of see where we can go from there. But it's difficult from an admin perspective to kind of drive that in a particular direction when a lot of it has to do with player interaction and player relationships. Can you give us a peek under the hood on artifacts and mechanics you'd like to see implemented, even if they're not slated for this year's roadmap? I don't have any plans for new artifacts, at least not in the near future. I'm always open to hearing new ideas for artifacts, but there's none that I actually particularly want to make. And a lot of that has to do with the drive, the amount of time that it takes to do those, the amount of time it takes to push those out, make sure that they're balanced. We've had some mistakes in the past with releasing artifacts too soon, and it turned out that they weren't balanced in their current form. And there's just a lot of brainstorming that also has to go into that to actually get new artifact ideas. So as players submit ideas, it's something that I'm definitely open to doing here and there, creating new artifacts, but it's not something that I have a specific push behind. As for new mechanics, there's definitely new mechanics that I want to add. Some of those are going to be focused around more vamping out of the aspects. We have a particular setup used for strongholds that we've been holding off on releasing to try and polish it a little bit more. So hopefully the mortar builders that we're going to be bringing up will help us get some of the item content in there, and then the mechanics can kind of work from there. So in addition to that, which is going to be something kind of like a tower defense game that is built inside of strongholds. Other than that, there are some additional mechanics that I'd like to do around hunting to make hunting less tedious. I don't want to get too deep into that until they're kind of more fleshed out. And then we have just generally some tweaks to existing mechanics that I want to do, and that's kind of the direction I still want to go in the near future, is to make sure that the mechanics that exist in the game are clean and compelling before I try to add a whole bunch more in. One of the things that we've seen is in the past we've tried to add additional combat mechanics or additional mechanics into the game without showing up the ones that exist, and as a result we get more and more and more, and sometimes those are engaging to players and sometimes they aren't, but the things that already exist in the game just continue to wallow in whatever state they're in. So I'd like to make the things that are there in the game better before we kind of move on. All right, let me scroll down here. The next question is about lag, but it was posted on January 10th, so it's been quite a while since then, and we've identified in the last 2 months quite a bit of cause of lag, particularly focused around death in combat. So hopefully that complaint is solved a little bit. We've also had some recent network issues that are at the ISP end for our hosting that have been impacting all of the games a little bit. But overall, I think that lag has definitely improved since this post was made. If that's not the case, please let me know. And we'll do some more profiling and see if there's any particular area of code that's a problem, and we can try to approach that from a code perspective. There's definitely enough resources behind the server that lag shouldn't be a significant issue most of the time. Are there any plans to make changes to circles or organizations in general? There are actually several questions around this, mostly having to do with population disparity, but also around the concept of having 3 separate organizations. And the first thing I want to say is that that's a concept that I'm very much behind. I very much want to continue to have a 3-sided conflict in Empyrean. What that has looked like in practice, especially lately, is that 2 sides will gang up on a third, and sometimes it's necessary because of population, but I think that it's happening too much. One of the things that we've lost over time in the last several years is the ideological differences between the organizations and between the different circles, and I'd really like to get back to that. So one of the things that I really want to push from a lore perspective and from a story perspective is that separation and that difference between the different circles, and give them more meaningful reasons in character to try and divide a little bit rather than coming all together as one group. So that's one of my primary goals in the near future. Hopefully that will also see adjustments in the way that cross-circle alliances are made, whether it decreases the likelihood of them or if it changes the way that they form and makes them more short-term. I definitely like to see that. We've had some very long-term alliances, whether official or not, over the years, over the last 10, 15 years, that largely have been longer probably than they should have been. So I'd like to get more of a separation between the circles and more of a meaningful ideological in-character reason for those things to exist. And then if we need to also push some mechanical things on top of that to influence even more, we can approach that. But my first step is I want to do that from an ideological perspective. The next question is if there are any planned changes to rating related to the population issue again. Right now, it's reportedly very much an off-hours thing, although the numbers don't really back that up when I look at the analysis. And the short answer is I'm fine with some tweaks here and there, but I think that rating as it is pretty fine. So I'll keep an eye on that, and I definitely want to hear more input about what rating issues might exist, but the rating system as it is, I'm not too unhappy with. A few years back, there was an Ice Golem event where players got collars of hardened Diacon. Originally, there were hints that you want to collect these because they'd have a use later on. To this date, they still have no use. During a stream about 2, maybe 3 years ago, this matter was brought up, and it was yet again mentioned that they'll probably have a use soon. But again, that was like 2 years ago. Is it safe to assume the collars won't have a use? No. They will be used at some point in the future. Exactly when and for what event, I don't know. But it's on my list of slated ideas, along with a lot of other lore-specific or really specific items and some other things that characters have made as decisions over the years. Those are things that I definitely want to include as we go. And some of the stories over the next year or two are hopefully going to be incorporating a lot of those elements, because I want to have the decisions that are made and the actions that are taken by players have a meaningful impact on them going into the future. So a lot of that is going to have to do with decisions that are made or have been made over time, having a continuous impact or coming back to help or bite people in the future. Are there plans to balance the beacon and quartz system? There are a lot of details that go into this question and a lot of kind of things around this. The short answer is I definitely recognize that there are problems with the system as it exists now. It definitely has kind of a positive feedback loop element to it, and that's a flaw of the system. Anything that has a positive feedback loop that means the winners keep on winning needs to be adjusted in some way. Exactly how, I'm not certain. There should definitely be benefits to winning, but those benefits shouldn't make you steamroll the opposition. So I definitely want to do something around this. It's a system that needs some focus, but I'm not sure what form that's going to take. It's definitely slated for the near future, but the near future could be the end of this year, it could be the beginning of next year, depending exactly on how other things come through and the amount of resources that we have to dedicate to making changes. So the short answer is yes. I fully recognize that there are issues with the system there, and I just don't have the fix for it ready today. But yes, there are plans to balance that system out a little bit, and that might mean completely revamping it. That covers the questions that were asked in January. So next up are the February questions. There are quite a bit fewer of these, so we'll get through them a little bit quicker. I also want to apologize for not having those January questions released during early February. I was incredibly sick from a conference that I went to. There have been some ideas floating around that it might have been COVID-19 that was just underreported during the time period, although I doubt it based on the symptoms and the incubation. But long story short, I was incredibly sick during a good chunk of February, but I'm quite a bit better now, and I'm going ahead and recording these answers from January and February. Now that interlude's over, let's go ahead and jump in. The first question from February has to do with the things that you can earn now that Empyrean is quote-unquote free to play, or that it has its new free model. The first few of those are the no-brainer lesson and credit packages as things that are purchasable in-game. That is something that we kind of pulled back on. It was announced in our initial plan as something that we were thinking about doing, but at the moment it's not in the plan. It's not something that we're going to have. And part of that is because having those initial purchases is somewhat inexpensive, but it also does kind of help the game get enough funding to continue its hosting and look at maybe doing some future investment in the game, which is something that we're looking at. It's on the table, so hopefully that comes to fruition pretty quickly. And if we remove all of those kind of methods of going into funding the game, then that would be a problem. That said, the no-brainers are fairly inexpensive, so losing that revenue would not be huge. It's a possibility in the future, but it's definitely something that we decided both in Empyrean and in Iron Realms as a whole not to do. So I'll bring it up to reapproach, but it's not planned in the near future. The other big one was credit auctions, where you're able to where we would hold an auction for some number of credits in game, unbound rather than bound, and that you could bid on those things with in-game gold. I do like that idea. It's something that kind of had slipped away from my visibility after we went free. So it's something that I want to stew on a little bit and see kind of what the credit in and out looks like. I don't want to unbalance the credit economy too much, but having that as an additional way for players to get credits is definitely a positive thing. The downside that I see there is that it would be another one of those positive feedback loops. People who are already buying credits and thus able to sell those for in-game gold would then have more gold to be able to spend in those auctions. So people spending money would then get more of those credits rather than the intention, which was for them to be an outlet for players who were not paying in as much to the game and have an opportunity to get credits in kind of a bigger way than the daily credits could. So I'll have to think about that and take a look at how those systems work and maybe think about how to implement that exactly so it's not just a feedback loop. But it's something it's an interesting idea that I definitely I want to pursue, at least as a thought experiment before pushing out to the game. I'd also like to know if it's possible to buy the elite membership and packages with gold or doubloons. Probably not. Again, in part because of the model that we have there. Those things are continual income, so they're a lot easier to track in the long run, just from a business perspective. And they also do help to fund the continued running of the game. The resources required to host the game are fairly low, but they're not non-existent. We'll continue to host the game whether Empyrean pays for that hosting or not. That's not a problem because those are low enough that we can take it out of revenue from other games. But if we can support that entirely within Empyrean, that's what we want to do. And again, I mentioned if as the revenue continues to be not bad, then we're going to look at what we can do to reinvest that into Empyrean. So even though the Empyrean will remain at its current free model, there's the possibility that we might be able to put additional resources into it as we kind of go into the future. Finally, some achievements have very small rewards. After a while, there's very few achievements left to work on, except those needing to be spread over a very long period of time. Are there plans to expand the list of achievements and perhaps review some rewards? Yes, one of the things that I would really like to do is go back through all of the achievements and rebalance them based on current Imperium. A lot of them were created in the past when the reward schemes were very different, and some of them were modified when we went free, some of them weren't. Particularly some of the very long running achievements. So it's definitely something that I'd like to adjust. That's going to take time sitting down with the entire list of achievements and balancing where they are now versus where I want them to be. So it's not going to be a small amount of work. It's going to be a dedicated time that I sit down and just work on that. But it is something that I'd like to do. I also want to create new achievements, but I don't have a whole lot of ideas there. Short of achievements surrounding new systems, creating achievements is something that takes a different kind of creativity than a lot of the work that I've been doing. And a lot of that has to do with looking at the mechanics that exist and the goals that players might have and finding a way to do that. So I want to add some achievements around the current aspect system with spirit gain, with some number of rooms to your stronghold, things like that. Maybe something around monolith capture, holding a certain number at a time or holding a certain number lifetime. But I definitely am open to new ideas for achievements as well, and particularly new ideas for rewards. There are a lot of mechanical rewards built in, but I'd like to add more things that are either flavor focused, like some of the dolls that we have, or that are more focused towards the actual systems that they come out of. And then the final question we have is, for curiosity's sake, what language is Empyrean written in? I would assume, since the initial code was handed off from Achaea, that it's written in an older language such as C. Yes and no. There's a little bit of a history here. Empyrean is written in a language called Rapture. Rapture is its own proprietary language written by Iron Realms, and it runs inside of the Rapture engine. The Rapture engine is, at the end of the day, just a virtual machine. If you're familiar with the way that the JVM works for Java, Rapture is very similar. There's a set of opcodes that are compiled from Rapture code. Those are then run inside of the Rapture virtual machine to do particular actions. So there's a bunch of intrinsic built-in functions. There's library functions that are then compiled, and all of that runs inside of the Rapture engine. The Rapture engine itself is written in C++. So the program that's running the code is C++, but the code itself is a proprietary language called Rapture, which is an opcode-based language. Rapture is intended to look and be written a lot like C code is from a code writing perspective. It's based on C, but it's simplified. It doesn't have raw pointers. It doesn't have as many variable types. In fact, the only numeric type in Rapture is a non-floating number. It's an integer. And there are strings and there are vectors. Vectors are counted arrays, and that's it. Those are the only variable types built in. There are also built-in databases which store each of those types. You can think of those kind of like arrays of arrays. It's an array of data values, an array of string values, an array of vector values. And those things are used in a similar way to the way that objects would be in an object-oriented language like C++ or like Java. Each player, for example, is an entry in the persona database, and the persona database has a whole bunch of characteristics around it to say this particular character has this name. That would be a string in that database. So that's kind of the long answer to your question. The short answer is it's a proprietary language called Rapture. There are Rapture documents, which I've linked a few times on the forums. They don't dive super deep into the way that you use the language, but they do kind of give an introduction to it. And then we also have a second language used for what we call soft code, which is mob progs. Mob progs are their own separate language that is event-based. So, for example, when you greet a mob, it will determine if the mob prog attached to that replica in-game has an event greeted. And if so, it runs through the code for that event. And that is also a virtual machine-based language, but the interpreter for that one is actually written in Perl, believe it or not. So the quote-unquote soft code that we use for programming items and mobs in the game with kind of their own custom code is one language, and then we have the hard code, which is the Rapture code, which is written in its own proprietary language and runs inside of a C++-based interpreter. So that answers that question. That is all of the questions that we have for February and January. So hopefully you got your questions answered. You have some kind of idea. I don't know if this is super helpful for you or not. I also plan to transcribe this, but if you have more questions, please, the March thread is open. If you think that this method of answering your questions isn't great, let me know. I definitely want some feedback around that so that we can adjust that in the future. And I hope that you continue to engage with me and continue to play Empyrean. Thank you very much.